time we get an introduction in, we'll be able to say it's 6:30. It's a little hot there. I don't know if we can turn that down just a hair. Okay. I adjusted it, Kara, and adjusted it too much. Thank you. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. If you have your Bibles, you want to be turning there. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Now remember, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the main thrust is really the end of an argument against a particular goings-on that was happening in Corinth. You remember what was happening in Corinth that Paul is addressing in 8, 9, and 10? It's a question that they seem to have. What are they wanting to do? Jennifer?
Eating the meat sacrificed to idols?
Yes, eating meat that is sacrificed to idols. And so that begins all the way back in chapter 8. We spent a couple weeks on chapter 8 and a couple weeks on chapter 9, so we're kind of spread out now, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that all of this is about eating meat offered to idols, or the shorthand, idol foods. And so that's what we're talking about. And so in chapter 8, the main argument for not eating food that was offered to idols is what? We should not eat food that has been offered to idols. Jennifer, you got it?
To be more aware of other people's
Right. Yes. So it's really an argument from, I don't want to offend anyone else, especially those, he uses the phrase, a weak conscience. Sometimes we tie that in with the book of Romans, where he talks about the weak and the strong. We think, well, these are people with a weak faith. But that's not what Paul calls them. He simply refers to them as a weak conscience. And so the idea is that we need to be mindful of one another. And so that's chapter 8. We need to be mindful of one another, and therefore not eat food that has been offered to idols. In fact, his great conclusion there in verse 13, I believe, is when he says, if eating meat causes my brother to stumble, I'll not eat meat. So chapter 9 is still about eating meat that is offered to idols, except when we look at it, it doesn't appear that way. It appears that maybe he's dealing with something else. In fact, in the first part of the chapter, he says, what rights do we have? As apostles, don't we have a right to take a wife with us? We have a right to take money for, the service and ministry that we're performing. And so, we might think, well, he's talking about, paying a preacher. But he even says, I'm not saying this so you'll start paying me. I'm saying this because we understand this principle, and the principle is that certain ministers of the gospel have a right. But his point was, even though I have the right to take the money from you, or even though I have the right to take a wife with me in my missionary journeys, even though I have these rights, he says what? I'll give up those rights for the sake of the gospel. Right? And so Paul is very, in that statement, we might say he is, the gospel is about Christ. We use the word sometimes Christocentric, which means Christ is at the center. So Paul is very Christocentric there, saying that even though I have a right, we might say egocentric, because I have a right, this is what I want to do, and that's what they are doing, is being very self-centered, egocentric. He says, I'm not going to be egocentric, I'm going to be Christocentric. I'm going to put Christ in the middle, and therefore I won't take money that is rightfully mine, or I won't avail myself of the things that are rightfully mine so that I can preach Christ. How far did that go? He goes into that section about becoming all things to all men, but it's still about his view that Christ is at the center of it all. And then you get down to the very end of chapter 9 when he goes into these athletic pictures, of running and fighting. And he says, I want to make sure that I am doing right. And he encourages them that you make sure that you are running well. Well, what does running well mean in the figures that he's using in verse 9? What does it mean to run to obtain it, this imperishable crown? I mean, we know, with the Olympics coming up, that what a runner has to do or what competitors do in order to win. But Paul is using that picture for the Christian life. So what does it mean in the Christian life to run well or run to obtain it?
Part of it is setting your eyes on the goal and not looking away.
Okay.
There's a couple different examples. A farmer that's plowing a field, if he sets a fence, plowing to that fence post, and he will plow a straight line. If he's plowing and he looks over here, or you're driving down the highway and you look off, you meander.
Right.
He says, I'm not going to meander.
Okay, so Paul uses that very idea in Philippians chapter 3 when he says, forgetting those things which are behind, I press on toward the mark of the prize of the high calling of God. And that, remember, we're having the Olympics, right? The original Olympics were happening during the days of Paul. Remember, every 4 years, during the days of Paul, they were having the Olympics in the Grecian states and the Roman world, so that he was very familiar with this. And the when you would running, if you were sprinting or running and you're coming up to the finish line, what do good runners do? You know what they call that? Right at the end. Yeah, Sam was back there doing it. They dip into the ribbon, right? They're coming in and then they press forward. Now, that's the very same word that Paul is using for this picture. He says, I forget what's behind me. I'm not looking at the other runners. Man, how a lot of Christians need to hear that lesson. I'm not concerned about the other runners. I'm concerned about my goal, what is in front of me, and I press down on that mark. Why? Because I want to be victorious. And so I'm going to run well. So, and I'll get to you in just a second, Jennifer, but the thing that we set our eyes on that Tim is talking about is Christian living, right? That's running well. Is so that we live our life in order to please God. All right, Jennifer?
Well, kind of to go off of that, when you're Olympic athletes don't just show up the day of the event and run and
Nope.
compete. You've got to plan ahead. You've got to take the time, do the practice, put in the hard work, the daily living in order to do that. You cannot run to receive the prize by just showing up.
Right. So we have this picture of the exercise, the training, but the idea when he says, so run that you may obtain it, he's saying, live righteously. That's the metaphor, is live righteously. And so, because if I don't live righteously, what could happen? Verse 27, he changes metaphors a little bit from that of running a race to that of boxing, but I discipline my body, I beat my body, and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So there is a sense in which if I don't live righteously, if I don't run well, he says I could be disqualified. Now, we look at the things that are happening in Corinth, and some of the things that are happening there, man, if they were happening at Brighton, we would think the apocalypse was upon us. The man living openly in incest with his stepmother. I mean, we would, things like that, we wouldn't stand for it, right? But yet Paul says you need to run righteously. You need to change your manner of life. And so even at this point, Paul has not said they are yet disqualified, but it's almost like he's saying, but you're getting close. You're getting close to that line of disqualification. But I like how he puts himself in the same boat. I've got to do it. He said, I'm not just asking you to do it. He says, I'm asking you to do what I already do, because I don't want to be disqualified. And he's not just saying, I want you to do this because you don't want to be disqualified. He says, I want you to do this because I don't want you disqualified. And that's the picture he's painting. So in verse 10, he says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." And so we'll stop there for just a moment. Of course, the idea of 4 is that he's going to build upon the arguments that he's making, and so it's not we're not getting into chapter 10 and say, oh well, he's completely left what he's talking about, and he's going to go into the discussion of the Lord's Supper. Not exactly, but he's tying it back into the same argument. I don't want you to be unaware, to be ignorant, brothers, that our fathers, and I love this first statement, our fathers. Who's he writing to? Gentiles. And he goes into a story about ancient Israel, who are not their fathers. Well, some have come along and said, well, this is a mixed congregation. There's evidence that there were Jewish Christians that had converted, and then obviously the large majority of them were Gentile Christians. So you have these two groups there, and that Paul is really addressing here the Jewish converts and not so much the Gentile converts. I don't see that. I think that there is a spiritual ancestry. In other words, these were the children of God, the Israelites, and they had this opportunity to live faithfully. And we are the children of the same God. And there is a continuity between Judaism and Christianity, right? In fact, what was it they said of Jesus? He was the sect of what? You remember? Well, actually, they said it of Paul, but they said he's of the sect of the Nazarene, right? Well, the Nazarene is talking about Jesus, who was from Nazareth, and the sect of is saying that he was a section of Judaism, right? Now, we generally, talk about this hard break, but Paul doesn't always put a hard break between Christianity and Judaism. He sees that there is a continuity between them. The stream of time didn't just automatically stop at the cross and then something completely new started, but rather our faith is born out of the history of Judaism. Our fathers, he says, in a very personal and possessive way, our fathers. Tim?
Well, it says we are all one in Christ. We're neither Jew nor Greek. And it continues.
Yes.
Well, if we're all one, that makes this sentence even more potent.
Absolutely. So it speaks not just of, we might say, their continuity, but it also speaks of their unity. But I also think that it speaks about Paul's expectations of the Gentiles in Corinth to know the Old Testament scriptures. What does he say in Romans 15 and verse 4? The what?
Everything is written in prior times is written for our instruction.
Yeah, so the things that were written aforetime, and that's pretty definitely an Old Testament allusion to the Old Testament scriptures. That was written for our learning, not just their learning, the people who were going through it, but our learning, that we still have something to learn from the Old Testament. I remember as a boy, before I obeyed the gospel, before I started going to the church, I used to attend the Baptist church quite a lot. And I remember in a Bible class, our teacher talking about the Church of Christ and how they don't believe in the Old Testament. And I was just incredulous because the Old Testament's a big part of the Bible. In fact, it's like 2/3 of the Bible. I mean, look, how can you not believe in over half the Bible? And I was just incredulous. But some people, they look at the church because we don't follow the 10 Commandments, or we don't follow by we don't sacrifice animals, and we don't burn incense, and we don't have a priesthood and that wears a certain kind of clothes, because we don't follow that law. And it was written for our learning, not for our legislation, but for our learning. It's something different. And so I see that's what's interesting here. Paul is looking at how the Old Testament is valuable, even in his day, and I would say even in our day. It's very valuable for us to learn and understand. Now, this gets into a little bit deeper subject. It gives us some insight into how Paul read the Old Testament, right? So the Jews, when they would, especially Jews that were contemporary with Paul, they would interpret the Old Testament scriptures in usually one of four ways. One was a literal translation or interpretation it tells about Noah, building an ark, being saved, and that actually happened, and therefore that is a literal interpretation of that event. But then they might turn around and do what's called a midrashic, or the midrash. And so whenever you're looking at Jewish writings, you have many midrash writings. And that's an interpretation which says, okay, that's what happened to Moses, but let's explore how that might apply to us today. And so they would bring it out of its ancient Noahic context and put it into a first or second century context in Judaism. How does that apply? Okay, so that was another one. Another one would be what they called pesher, which was this didn't really mean that, it means this. This of the ancient times really referred to this. We see it, for example, in Acts chapter 2, when the issue of this is that which the prophet Joel spoke of. And so that would be considered a pesher interpretation. This thing that Joel spoke about, this is what it's talking about. And then the fourth way was allegory, which is you basically you mythologize everything. It's kind of a crude way of putting it, but a lot of times that's what happens. So when we read Paul in Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, in all of his letters, when Paul quotes from the Old Testament, we see Paul using all four of these methods at different times. And so, for example, in Galatians chapter 4, he says, now this by interpretation is an allegory. So he kind of tells us right up front, I'm going to use an allegory. By the way, that is Paul's least used means of interpreting Old Testament scriptures, allegory, which really ought to say something to us and how we start to allegorize things. But for Paul, it was very uncommon for him to use an allegory. So that leaves you a literal interpretation, a midrashic interpretation, and a pesher. So let me ask you the question. When Paul starts going through this particular passage, or these things, about the cloud and the sea, he's obviously talking about the crossing of the Red Sea in the Exodus, chapter 14 and so forth. How is he using it here? What method do you see him using here?
Multiple.
Okay, you've got three choices. Are you saying all three? The first two at least? Okay. Now interpretation, let me take this back a step. He believes this literally happened, okay? But the interpretation he's putting on it, I don't think is a literal interpretation. I think if you go back and read Exodus in its context, never at any given time would you say Christ is the rock, right? I mean, you wouldn't. Not that, I think that takes someone inspired to make that connection, okay? So I don't think it's literal. I don't think he's saying those things really happened to prove this point, that this is that. I don't really see that as his motive. I think it's more midrashic, which is he's looking at the things that happen and he's interpreting them, or we might say reinterpreting them for his modern context. I think that's what he's doing. And he does this because he has a very Christocentric view of the Old Testament scriptures. And that's important because anytime Paul uses the Old Testament scriptures, he does so with an understanding that, yes, that's what happened to Noah. But even that has a Christological fulfillment in it, right? Yes, I see what happened in Moses' life, but even that has a Christological emphasis to it. And so the doctrine, as we refer to it as the sensus plenior, which means the fuller meaning. For Paul, the fuller meaning of the Old Testament was always found in Christ. And the way he uses Scripture, it appears that that's that it's not out of line for us to say that's how Paul views the Scriptures. Now, Jennifer?
Is this, we've talked about in the past a while ago, the type and anti-type. It seems like he's putting the second one to the first one here, like you say that.
Right. So when we talk about type-antitype relationship, we often refer to the antitype as the substance. The type is the foreshadowing, and the antitype is the actual event. I don't so much see a type-antitype, although I have to admit, he does say in verse 6, now these things took place as an example, and the word example here is translated from the word tupos, which is the word type. It's where we get our word type. If you transliterate tupos, it is T-Y-P-O-S, and tupos. We get our word type exactly from this word. But I don't think he's using it in the type-antitype relationship that we would normally think of antitype. Although, I guess in a sense he is, but I think, I don't know that he's saying that the events that are happening in Corinth are of the greater importance than the things that were happening then. And that's usually the type-antitype relationship, is that the antitype is of more important. We talk about shadow and substance, my corporeal body is the substance. That's the shadow. Well, which one has more import? Well, the actual me and not my shadow. So that's generally the relationship we use in type and antitype. But Paul does say these things are an example. We need to look to them and learn the lesson. So what key word do we see in verses 1 through 4 that's used over and over, or that's circled in my notes? All. Okay? I don't want you to be ignorant. Our fathers were all under the cloud. What cloud? Okay, the cloud that directed them, right. Exodus 13 and 14, as they are leaving Egypt, God appeared to them in a pillar of cloud and went before them, right, and led them through the way. Now, by the way, when it goes, you remember what happens to the pillar of the cloud when they go through the Red Sea and they're on the other side? Yeah, that's right. It goes around and it gets behind them. It's led them to this point, and then it comes around and it gets behind them because it separates the Egyptians from the Israelites. But there again, it's still God's presence and God's protection, God's guidance. All of that is represented. So they were all under this cloud, and all passed through the sea. So he's obviously talking about the Exodus. We're talking about the parting of the Red Sea, Exodus 14, and all of them passed through. What kind of ground did they pass through on? Dry ground, right. And what was the water like? It was walls on both sides of them. So you have this, in my mind, I'm picturing, there's water on both sides of them. There's the cloud that they're under that is above them, except Exodus doesn't really say the cloud is above them, but in front of them. But I don't know what a pillar of cloud looks like. I don't know how dissipated that is. I do know that clouds made up of what? Water. So they're surrounded by water in some way. And Paul's going to use that. But notice again, he says, and all were baptized into Moses. Now, none of them got wet. Right? That's part of the great miracles. They didn't get wet. But the idea is that they're passing through the midst of the water, and that's like us passing through the midst of baptism, and they're baptized into Moses, in the cloud and in the seed. Right? The reason I think Paul keeps emphasizing the all, all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized, is because he's talking about a shared corporate event. This is what they shared in their history. Okay? Everyone went through this. Not only that, all ate the same spiritual food, and all spirit. He is emphasizing this was what Israel, all Israel, during that time went through and experienced this. Now, what was their food? Right, Exodus 16. They're hungry. They begin to grumble. Go figure. And so God tells Moses, get the people ready. Tell them, here's what they're going to do. And in the morning, when they get up, there'll be food. Right. So they got up in the morning. They came out of their tents, and you remember what they said?
What is it?
What is it? But in the Hebrew, they said, manna. And what did they call it? Manna. Manna. The word manna means, what is it? So, and that was really the best they had. It was described like a flake-like substance, the color of coriander, a wafer-like thing that, they would sometimes eat it whole. They could grind it up and boil it, make cakes out of it, and they could do all these different things in it. But they didn't really have a word for it other than, what is it? I don't know what it is. They had quail that would feed them as well. And they all drank the same spiritual drink. Well, when we say spiritual here, when we hear the word spiritual, let me say we. When you hear the word spiritual, what do you think of? What pops in your mind with the adjective spiritual?
Non-physical.
Non-physical, not worldly. Was their food not physical? I mean, the bread they were eating, it was real bread. Well, it was real manna, wasn't it? The quail was real quail. The water that they drank. Remember the rock in Exodus 17 when Moses was told to strike the rock, and the rock produced water. And, they drank that water. That water was real water, right? It wasn't. So how does Paul get away calling it spiritual? Ron?
It was divinely provided.
Yes, I think that's the deal. It's not that spiritual necessarily means non-physical, but it's provided in this way, in this case, supernaturally, and of course, that's going to, I think, touch the spirit to know that God is supplying my every need in this moment. And another place he says their clothes didn't wear out, their shoes didn't wear out. That's again God spiritually seeing to their needs. And you think that won't affect your spirit? Of course it would. And so I think that's where Paul, it's this idea that God has supplied their needs, their physical and spiritual needs. Now, and he says, and they all drank from the spiritual rock, right? We know the story of the rock in Exodus 17. In fact, he names the place Massah and Meribah, right? Massah means testing or proving. They put God to the test, in other words. And they quarreled with God. Meribah means quarrel, fight. And so Moses called the place, this was the place we tested God and fought with him. And every time we come back by here, remember how we tested God That's the idea of naming places like this. And so, but he says, here's that rock. But notice what he says. The rock did what? Followed them. Did the rock follow them on its own? Did they carry the rock with them so that it followed them in their wanderings? How did the rock follow them? Tim?
I think it's symbolic from the cloud going before or following after. Pillar by day, cloud, pillar by fire at night. And I'm thinking that the semblance of the rock and Christ.
But he says that this is the rock that they drank from. He's making a reference to an actual physical rock. So you remember? So this is kind of at the very beginning of the wilderness wanderings. Toward the very end, in what is it, Numbers 25? It's escaping my mind right now. But it's toward the very end of the wanderings. There's another time where they grumble against God because they don't have anything to drink, and God sends Moses out to not strike the rock, but what? Speak to the rock. And of course Moses messes up and he strikes the rock anyway. But you kind of have this bookend of them, of the rock giving water, and the rock, remember, still gave water even when Moses struck it. Still gave the water. And so some have suggested, well, because their journey is bookended by the rock giving water, that's what he means by the rock is following them. But I don't think that's it. I don't think that's necessary. There's actually an old tradition, even among the Jews, that says that the rock was small enough that they actually carried the rock with them. And when they made camp, they struck the rock, and the water would come forth again. And then they'd move to another place and carry the rock with them, and then they'd hit the rock again, and the water would come out. It was like built-in plumbing during the wanderings. I don't think that happened either. I don't think Paul's even worried about whether the physical rock that gave water followed them. He's concerned with what? Christ. Christ is following them. Well, there's that Christocentric view that, because I don't think you would read Exodus 17 and think, oh, well, that's Christ. And he's going with them. You would think, yes, this is God supplying water, but the second person of the Godhead is coming down in some sort of a manifestation, in this case in the rock. But Paul sees it. Paul sees this providence or this care and sustenance of the people. The reason why that happens is because of Christ. Christ followed them, and the rock was Christ. See? And so even Paul, looking back thousands of years later, he sees in those events Christ. You see how Paul becomes Christocentric in his interpretation of the Old Testament. And again, I think that you would have to be inspired to see those things. And the same with Jesus. There are several references Jesus makes that you would never have read them in the Old Testament and say, well, that applies to Christ. Like them, bringing the, coming up out of Egypt. You would have never, people who read those words in the Old Testament times never thought, well, the Messiah is going to come from Egypt. They never would have thought those things. Or Rachel weeping over her children, that it's Rachel weeping over the sacrifice of Christ. Those things wouldn't have been there. But Jesus, who is God, obviously can make that application if he needs to or wants to. And Paul, being inspired, can do much the same thing. And so, they have this common shared experience that God has taken care of them, and he has done so through baptism, what Paul says is baptism, that initiated them into the relationship of deliverance with God, and this meal of food and drink that sustained them during the wilderness wanderings, and that was all shared. Nevertheless, verse 5, with most of them, God was not pleased. Now notice he's gone from all to what? Most. when we think of the number of people that there were coming out of the land of Egypt, how many of them from the year, the day they left, anyone who was 20 years old and older, how many of them made it to the promised land? I think I heard it somewhere. Two. Joshua and Caleb. Most is kind of an understatement there, isn't it? The kids survived, but an entire generation died in the wilderness. God was not pleased with them. Why? Well, he's going to show us in just a moment. But anyone who knew Israel's history, even those who were Gentiles in Corinth, knew that they were that they didn't obey God. So, for they were in the wilderness. I don't like that translation, overthrown. The word can also mean like laid low. But I think that another translation, which the way Paul seems to be using it here, is strewn about. And so there's this picture of Israel for 40 years wandering through the desert and leaving in its wake bodies littered throughout the wanderings, throughout the wilderness. They're strewn about. And I think that's the picture that Paul is painting. Look, this is how dire it got. Now, the application he's making to them is, hey, that all the Israelites were baptized into Moses and started that relationship. Guess what? All the Corinthians were baptized into Christ and started that relationship. Hey, all the Israelites ate and drank of this spiritual food that is supplied by God. All the Corinthians also partake of a spiritual supper that's been supplied or commanded by God. Right? The Lord's Supper. Now, he'll get into specifically the Lord's Supper in a moment, but I think he's giving us a picture that that's what's coming up. But notice, they all shared this, and yet most of them fell away. Most of them fell. Their bodies littered the wilderness that they went through for 40 years. And if you don't change, or if you don't pay attention to how you're running, you will also fall. You see, that's his application. It's about eating that meat that is offered to idols. And he'll get there in verse 14. He'll make the emphatic statement. But this is the direction he's going. Look at your common history and how they shared in these wonderful blessings, and yet they still fell, and how you share in wonderful blessings, and there's a possibility of you still falling. When we're talking with people about the doctrine of once saved, always saved, I don't think we often go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It's not one of the primary texts that we go to when we talk about once saved, always saved. But it's pretty clear, isn't it? You need to watch out because they fell too. Now, these things, he says, took place as an example for us that we might not desire evil as they did. Now, this word desire, this word occurs all of one time in the New Testament. It's the only place it occurs in the New Testament. It is used in the Old Testament, ironically, in the very places that Paul is quoting from. And it means the idea of maybe craving. And so in Numbers 11 and verse 4, for example, it's used there in the Septuagint. He says, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. And so if you're familiar with the context of Hebrews chapter 11, you know that God, he decides to give them meat, but he says, I'm going to give you a lot of meat. I'm going to give you so much meat that you're going to get sick of meat. I'm going to put you on the keto diet, he said. And so they get sick of the quail. It says that the quail. Right? Now, in fact, in Numbers verse 11:34, when you get to the end of that, it says that a plague went throughout the camp, and people died because they were eating this meat, this quail. They died with quail in their mouth. And Moses, notice he named the place Kibroth Hattaavah, right? Which means literally graves of the cravers. Okay? So now Paul uses that same word from those two verses in Numbers, which, by the way, are also mentioned in Psalm 106 and Psalm 78 when they're retelling these stories. And he says, this is an example for us that we might not desire, we might not crave evil as they did. What were they craving? The Numbers 11 doesn't say they were craving evil. What does it say they were craving? Meat. So how can Paul now say they were craving evil? How is meat evil? Well, it goes back to God was feeding them with the manna, right? And probably still the quail at this time. But when you read Numbers 11, they don't want the quail. They said, I wish we were back in Egypt where we had the meat pots, where we just dip our hand in and pull meat out, and there was cucumbers and melons and all kinds of produce. I wish we had. What are they doing? They're rejecting God's care of them and the food which God has supplied. And they want a food that man has supplied. And in that way, rejecting of God and latching on to man, that's evil. That's why Paul is able to say they wanted something evil. They craved evil. So in verses 7 through 10, we'll go through these pretty quick here. He says, do not be idolaters. That's number one, idolaters. As some of them were. Now notice in verses 6 through 10, he uses the word some. Again, in contrast to the all in verses 1 through 4, now it's some. Some of them were idolaters, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. A quote from Exodus 32, verses 5 and 6. What's the context of Exodus 32? Anyone remember?
Is that the golden calf?
Yes, it's the golden calf. And so they've come to Aaron, they said, we don't have an idol. By the way, Psalm 106, when they make reference to this, they got up and played the whore or the harlot by chasing after a false god and leaving God behind. And so there's a bit of a sexual overtone here, or undertone, we might say, to that statement. Now, what's interesting is in verse 7, he tells them how they did these things. In verses 8, 9, and 10, when he tells about the other sins they committed, each time he talks about the result of what happened. So, verse 8, notice he shifts from you do not be idolaters to we, first person plural. He's including himself in this, just like he did back in chapter 9, verse 27. I buffet my body. I'm included in this as well. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, or some translations, fornications, as some of them did, and 23,000. And this is, if you'll remember the story of Phinehas, or Phineas, depends on how you want to pronounce it, in Numbers chapter 25. Remember that they were in the Moabite land. The men were going out and playing, having sex with the Moabite women. And then there was this one guy that he brought his Midianite, woman right up. Finney comes with a spirit. Stuff. Well, obviously they are so emboldened in their sin to do this before the house of God, before the congregation of the people. And one man had the audacity to step up and stop this nonsense. In fact, it says that he saved the nation. His zeal saved the nation. But there's a problem, and we'll talk about it next week. I'll give you a hint. Numbers 25 and verse 9 says that 24,000 died. Why does Paul say 23,000 died? We'll chew on that next week. As we